In recent weeks, our country's leaders have had a lot of conversation about what they expect of someone fitting into a particular role, in the case of a Supreme Court justice, for example. It began with the president's campaign promise to appoint the first black woman justice, and then an opportunity to do so. Then there was concern that that selection be based on more than race and that a highly qualified individual be found. The conversations in the confirmation hearings were sometimes difficult to listen to, sometimes probably telling us more about the person who was asking the questions rather than the person answering them. And I'm grateful for the grace and experience that Ketanji Brown Jackson brings to that task. I'm also grateful that the highest human court in our country now better reflects the demographic and life experience of our whole country. We need to pray for God's wisdom to be with Judge, soon-to-be Justice Jackson, and for that whole assembly with the work they have ahead of them. The hearings have been a clear example of those involved having their own set of expectations of who they believe should be in that role, and a struggle when the nominee wasn't someone who fit their preconceived ideas. This problem of a poor fit between expectation and reality has been around for a long time. I suspect that once we as human beings form our own ideas about who we're looking for a particular role, it's hard for us to see outside of that box. It can be hard to see the gifts of someone who's different than who we expect, even if we're looking at someone who was both divinely appointed and sent by God. Because this passage is about a processional as Jesus entered Jerusalem. Processionals were traditional for generals and troops returning from war, or to welcome a ruler. A historian of that period named Josephus writes of at least 2 other processionals that would have happened right after Jesus' time. One welcoming the leader of a Jewish revolt to overthrow the Romans, Simon Bar-Jorda, who rode into town to challenge Roman authority. Details we have on his processional. And another one happened shortly after that, when Emperor Vespasian rode into town to celebrate the defeat of that Jewish revolt. So the people of Jerusalem were on the lookout for a leader who had the gifts needed to overthrow the Romans, someone to lift up and take on the Romans. But Jesus wasn't going to fit into that expectation, even though it's him we're still speaking of today, and only very specialized historians can tell you anything about those 2 other guys. Jesus came into the world not to be exactly who people expected or who we want him to be, but instead to be the example of who God needs us to be as God's people in the world. He was to be an example for us, not to lead people to overthrow the Romans. So this account tells us that a multitude of disciples gathered to escort Jesus, and they spread their cloaks out on the road ahead of him, and they sang the Hallel psalms of praise, giving thanks for all that they'd seen him do. Word of Jesus' healing miracles, including raising Lazarus, and his teachings had spread, so he was somebody to notice entering the city. Apparently, people thought his leadership had possibilities. Jerusalem at that time was a city of about 55,000, slightly bigger than our combined lakeshore communities. But for the temple festival that Passover was, the population at those times swelled to over 180,000. So many people from surrounding communities gathered. Was that like Green Bay on a Packer weekend, possibly? That might be our equivalent now. that could be. We have an unusual amount of detail about how Jesus chose to enter the city. He gave very specific instructions to his disciples he sent to get the colt, even about what to say if they were questioned. The Lord needs it. The Lord needs it. That was all that needed to be said. Jesus, in that, was staking claim to his arrival as the fulfillment of a prophecy, fulfilling that portion of Zechariah that says, "Jerusalem, lo, your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem. The battle bow will be cut off, and he shall command peace to all the nations." Because in those details of fulfilling prophecy, Jesus was sending a message that the events of his life were unfolding for God's purposes. He was fulfilling God's purposes, and he was making sure his choices of action fit into what God needed for the people of the world. We could say that the shape of the cross alone literally represents what Jesus gave us. We needed Jesus to connect us with God's love, and that's represented by the vertical stake. And Jesus came to show us how to live together in love, represented by the cross piece, as when Jesus stretched out his arms for all the people of the world out of love. How often do we pause to consider before we act whether what we're about to do is what God needs us to do? That's what Jesus did. He paused to consider what he did was what God needed him to do. How often can we make the statement about our actions, "The Lord needs it," because that will be true for more than fetching a colt to fulfill a long ago prophecy. Today, God needs us to continue to act in the shape of Christ, connected with our God and on behalf of others. The Lord needs that. And we may not, all of us, be able to figure out how to impact the giant stuff of the world right away. But I believe that all of our hearts are hurting right now together as we see countless innocent people losing their lives before our eyes on the news. And the hardest things in our lives are the things that need those two things the most: connection to God and our care of others. The happenings of the world need both of those things more than words can say right now. Those two things need to shape our response to anything that's happening when we strive to live in the world following Christ, remaking our lives to take the shape his life did: connection with God and care of others. After this welcome to Jerusalem, the story of Jesus' life through this week includes doing everything he came to do. He connected himself with God for the strength to confront the temple authorities. He gathered his disciples for a last supper, and then he gave himself up to those who came to arrest him. He endured being beaten and scourged, and then a hearing and trial. The week ends with him being nailed to a cross where he hung till he died. That cross represents all that he did for us, and our task is to shape our lives around our relationship with God and our care of others. Jesus, in his life and death, is our best example of that. May we stay with his journey through this whole week, even when the events are hard to hear about. And as followers of Jesus, we have to acknowledge we'll be called on to do hard things as well. Any week of our life might turn into Holy Week for us. when we companion people through illness or pain, or confront people who've forgotten that their actions are to honor God, or we talk about something in our family that we've been avoiding talking about, or we face the death of someone we love at their side. These are all hard things that we face in our human lives, but we can do them with God's help and care for others. Let's recall the events that mark Jesus' journey through this week. He took those events on because God sent him to do that out of great love for all of us. And whether we're ready to stand next to him or whether we're watching from a distance, as some of those folks who gathered around the cross, may we receive his gift of love for the world, for each of us, because the Lord needs us to do that. And in doing so, we are the ones who are forever changed. Amen. Amen.